Hello there. Welcome to Just the Discs. We talk about Blu-rays here. My name's Brian, and today we are talking about Scream Factory and one of my favorite horror movies of the last, 15, 20 years even. I mean, this movie, when did this movie come out? This came out, I want to say 2008 or 9, but I will verify that. But we are talking about The Strangers, and it really is, for me, one of the most effective horror films in recent memory. And I think that has to do with the fact that it is quite a relatable movie on a couple levels. Of course, it stars Liv Tyler and Scott Speedman as a couple, and they are in a place where, I don't want to spoil too much, but basically they have a relationship. It may have advanced to a point on one level where things are about to escalate, but maybe it's not necessarily gonna be all warm and cuddly, which I think is an interesting place to start. So you really start with a emotional drama about two people, and then it slowly becomes this terrifying scenario of home invasion, and I think we can all kind of relate to that, you know. Director Brian Bertino brings up the idea of, you know, in the features anyway, of that feeling you get when you are awakened in the middle of the night by a sound from your house. And maybe it's nothing, you know, it almost never is anything, but the sound is enough to alarm you, and you know, are either asked to go check on it or you decide to go check on it. And he said, and I think he's right, that we've all kind of been there. We've all been in that situation. And that, what if there was somebody there? And how would you react? And how might that play out? And so it's really grounded in that way. And I totally appreciate and understand the idea of horror movies trying to establish character by letting us spend time with them before they're killed. But I think this movie is actually unique in that it does just a little bit more than that. And it actually allows us to feel for these characters and where they're at before anything happens. But we know something's supposed to happen, so there's always kind of the tension of what's coming, you know. So it is quote unquote slow burn, if you will, but it is it's just a little bit better than that ultimately. And so for me, it was just a movie that I clicked with like right away when I saw it, and I just thought, wow, this is something special. And it's crazy to find out, it came out in 2008. So we've had a lot of elevated horror since then. But like I said, this one really stands out, and it's gotten a sequel, and then now another trilogy of sequels, I guess, is what's coming. I don't fully understand the vision for Rennie Harlin's thing that he's working on, but unfortunately slightly diminishing returns since this one, because I really do think it was unique. Apparently only the third script that Brian Bertino had written, and he entered it in a contest, and it found its way to Universal at first, and then he was fired, and some other directors were attached, Justin Lin, Mark Romanek, I think, and then eventually ended up at Rogue Pictures, and he was brought back on board to direct, and I'm so glad he was, because he was clearly the guy to do it. He clearly had the vision for this. down to the, production design of the house, which is a really specific, and apparently, it says it's based on true events. And that's always dicey, because what does that mean? How much of it is true? How much has been, elaborated upon? But apparently, in the features, he talks about the living in sort of a remote rural area, like this film takes place in. There's like a house, and then there's no houses around for a long time. And, I'm from the Midwest, and we had some friends that had houses like this, where you really had to drive a little ways to get there, and there wasn't a neighbor or anything like that. So that is a little bit alarming. So Brian Bertino says something about the fact that he and his sister were often left alone in this remote house, and that there was a night where somebody knocked at the door and asked for some friend that, of course, wasn't there, and his sister answered the door and conversed briefly with this person, and then they went away. And I guess what he found out was that later, the next day, they found out that they were knocking on doors all around the area, and if nobody answered, they would break into the house. And so I think there were some break-ins. So it's a little different. And the other thing that influenced him, I guess, among a few things, but that that idea of hearing a noise. But he had read Helter Skelter as a young person, and the idea of the Manson family and their brutal attack and how random that was, just really stuck with him. And he's really made an effective film out of those couple ideas. So Liv Tyler and Scott Speedman and Glenn Howerton from It's Always Sunny. And yeah, it's just really well done, and it's always got me, and it is well sound designed, and by that I don't mean there's tons of sound design in it. In fact, I believe they actually worked hard to strip away a lot of that to make it more effective. And this particular shot that you're seeing on the cover is one of the great shots in a horror movie in recent memory, especially as it plays in the movie. Just really, with a crowd especially, just like boom, really just nailed that moment. And it's not like that moment had never been done before or since. In fact, I feel like it's been a lot since, but it just felt like a really well timed and played moment that kicked things up when it needed to. And yeah, I just love that there is not much in the way of explanation from the killers, from the strangers, like why they're doing this. Because you were home is the answer, and that we don't really get much beyond that. I've always found that much more terrifying, more grounded, because realistically, you're not going to have somebody tell you why they do something like in a movie. They're not going to start monologuing, as they say, and you're just never going to know a lot of times why bad things happen. They may uncover it weeks later, but ultimately, if you're the victim of such things, you may not know, and that is so much more terrifying than getting the motivation of things and hearing backstory. Like, I don't need it. I don't want it. And so I've always found this very effective. So this is a really nice set. This is, so Shout Factory had released a Blu-ray set, which I have here, a 2-disc set. And I want to show you that you may say, okay, so this is a 3-disc set, right? Now we have the 4K and we have 2 Blu-rays. It's not reversible, by the way. But so here are the 2 Blu-rays, just to show you what those look like. Okay, so if you're like, oh, they just added the 4K, and they took the old Blu-rays. These are different looking than, and that's not necessarily to say that the contents are different, but I believe that they are. So we have this new 4K scan, which I think really looks nice. It is from the digital intermediate. It's a new 4K presentation from the original digital intermediate. And I do think it adds detail. I do think it adds depth to the blacks. And I just like how it looks. That disc does not have anything else on it. It's presented in Dolby Vision, DTS HD audio. Then in terms of the Blu-rays, I'm just looking at the back here. I guess the features are kind of the same, but the discs, like I said, are different. But I'm going to go through everything anyway, because there's a lot of neat stuff here, and I think it's, like I said, it's just a nice presentation. I mean, it is a little bit of that thing we've seen from Criterion, which is, them just giving us a new 4K and nothing else. So it doesn't necessarily have like brand new features, but it has a lot of nice features, and I get why this is the new trend for studios or the boutiques is to, and you can start to see them cutting corners in terms of paying for new features. But anyway, so you have your 4K, which looks really nice. Then on disc 2, and this does appear to be the same features as I'm just looking at the back of the Blu-ray set, the original Blu-ray set, which says The Element of Terror, interviews with cast and crew, deleted scenes. It doesn't mention this other little featurette called Strangers at the Door, but I haven't checked the disc to make sure that's there or not. But basically on disc 2 and 3 we have, so the 4K is the theatrical version, okay? And it is, it's the 4K is the unrated version, excuse me. Yeah, new 4K presentation for digital intermediate, presented in Dolby Vision, 4K UHD, unrated version. Okay, so then on the first Blu-ray we have the theatrical version, and that has a couple featurettes. They're kind of like the EPK, of the period, little fluffy, short things. First one is called The Element of Terror. It's about 9 minutes. And they interview the production designer, talking about this as like a terror film, interviews Brian Bertino, and talking about grounding the story, starting with the house. And they talk about the house and then building the house on a warehouse set and how that caused problems with audio because there's a lot of noise in terms of knocking. And there's, this has some of the best knocks in movies, in terms of like how creepy they are and how loud they are. But the screams would really echo and stuff. So I think they had to deal with that in terms of the audio. But just the house, the way it looks from the outside and where it's located, all that stuff. And then they talk to, again, the production sound designer. They talk to Liv Tyler. She talks about screaming and how she hadn't really done that much and how physical the performance was. And at one point she says it's more physical than emotional, and the other point she says it's more emotional than physical. It obviously was a very, demanding performance from her, and she does a great job with it. Glenn Howerton talking about prosthetics, stunt coordinator talking about a truck stunt that takes place in the film. And then in Strangers at the Door, which is about 9.5 minutes, it's mostly Bertino and the cast, not just Liv Tyler and Speedman, but the strangers and all these folks talking about the story and that idea of hearing the noise in the middle of the night and how everybody's affected by it and their own sort of takes on why it's scary. And, so it's neat, but a little bit fluffy at the end of the day. And you move on to disc 3, the unrated version, and that has new interviews with writer-director Brian Bertino and actors Kip Weeks and Laura Margolis. So that's mentioned, but what's not mentioned is there's an interview with the editor as well. So I'm not 100% sure what's been added. I think it's basically the same, but they may have added a couple things here. So, defining moments, writing and directing The Strangers, Brian Bertino interview. Now, this is obviously for me, the best feature on here. It's almost 30 minutes long, and Bertino tells the story of, selling this script after it won a contest and being pulled into the world of filmmaking, at Universal, and how big a deal that was, and then being fired and having other directors attached, like I said, Mark Romanek and Justin Lin, and then finding his way back to the project once Rogue Pictures took over. But the idea that he was like 10 weeks out or something from production, and he went and bought Sidney Lumet's book, Making Movies, because he was, I think, panicking a little bit about, what to do as a director. And he bought it, he said, not because he was necessarily a fan of Lumet, although he is, but he said because it was the smallest book on directing he could find. Luckily, it's also one of the best, so, I'm sure it helped. But he also said the movie was shelved for like a year, and that when it did finally come, he wasn't sure that anybody was going to get to see it. And when it did finally come out, he was a little bit shocked that it even had come out. And that's one of those things that's always kind of shocking to me, is when you hear about a movie that we know is now something of a classic, as recently as 2008, it still feels like a classic. And how the studio, I guess, did not have confidence in it at that time. Maybe based on what was going on in horror cinema at the time, I don't know. But obviously it's a movie that connected with people in a big way. This and, there was a handful of films around this time, I feel like, that really connected with people, but this one in a huge way. But yeah, he just talked about the Helter Skelter stuff, his family living in a remote area. A lot of the stuff I talked about in the intro, he goes into like detail about, and all these things that were the genesis of the idea and his idea of the vision of it. And it's just a really solid interview. It was only his third script, I think I mentioned that, and that he had not even gotten a paycheck for his first paycheck for the movie before he was fired. But also that this was the last gasp of horror movies of this type getting a better treatment than they get now. It feels like budgets have obviously shrunk a good deal, and this is still a time when horror films of this type could get like a $10 to $15 million budget, and so they can afford to rebuild the house in a studio or in a warehouse and make the filmmaking that much more controlled. So he had a lot of advantages, he feels like, that horror filmmakers now don't have. He talks about the casting, he talks about figuring out the masks, and I should say the masks for me are actually one of the great things about the movie. He wanted them to seem like masks that these people could have gone out and bought that day at, like, a convenience store or at a store nearby. And the burlap sack just seemed like something that could be made easily. And they're just very effective. And I do think masks go a long way to making a movie scary and making it memorable. And obviously those masks are then, used in all the films since this one, I think. I think they're using the same masks. They're just so effective in that way. So simple yet so effective. But yeah, it just goes into all kinds of detail about the movie, the idea, the production. It's really well done. There's then this All the Right Move, Kip Weeks on playing the Man in the Mask, about 11 and a half minutes. And he talks about not getting the script in advance, but he got a character breakdown, and he had to sing a folk song in the audition, and he remembered playing the spoons as a kid, so he brought that into the audition and did his folk song with that, and I think that helped him get the role. And the other thing I thought that was interesting is he talked about how he was going to play it, because he can't use his face, and they don't talk. That's another thing I love about him, is that they don't really talk, except for a little bit at the end. And I much prefer that than sort of smart alecky, quippy stuff, which sometimes happens, or just chatter in general. Just don't give me any of that. I don't want it. I don't need it. And so he was like, how can I make this character effective? And he talked about going to the zoo with his son and seeing the gorillas behind the glass and how their eyes looked and maybe a little bit of how they moved, but also the idea of never moving his eyes, always turning his head to look at things and how creepy that is. But yeah, using the gorilla's eyes as a taking off point for what he might do, I think really is an interesting thing. A little more stuff in that interview, but enjoyable. And then Brains and Brawn, Laura Margolis on playing Pinup Girl. She's the smallest of the three strangers, but the most physical. And so she talks about her memories of working with Brian Bertino and the set, and apparently she didn't audition. She was called in to help the male leads read with someone because Liv Tyler was in New York at the time, and so she was reading as the Liv Tyler character, but not, as a possible casting choice. They'd already cast Liv Tyler. But then she got a call back about this stranger character, and she jumped at it, and she goes into detail about how she had a certain psychological approach to the character, how to make it scary through movement, and the first time she scared Liv Tyler, how she was told basically, don't let Liv see you in the mask until the actual shot, because Liv Tyler wanted to really feel scared. And it works. You do feel that from her, and I think that's always a great thing to do, is to let an actor really feel something and not have to work as hard on their own. She talked about a couple stunt scenes she didn't do, but like it's a neat little interview. 13 minutes and 44 seconds. And after that, we have this interview with the editor, Kevin Grutert, on editing The Strangers. And this is about 20 and a half minutes. And he's a really interesting dude. He worked on the first 4 Saw movies, 3 of which he did before this movie. The 4th one he did after. He did The Collection. He did Jigsaw. He did Saw 10. And so he's got a lot of experience with this kind of film, but this is a little different than what he'd been doing. Obviously, the Saw films are different than this film. So he said it was the first true slow burn horror film he'd worked on, and it was reshaped and rethought more than any other movie he'd ever done. And he does go into detail about some ideas that they had based on the script, but then some changes that they made after some test screenings, multiple changes to different sections, including the ending of the film, that are really interesting to hear. He'll talk about like how specifically the nuts and bolts of how they found certain shots to make certain things work. Like in the moment in the script, maybe certain things make sense, but then you're doing it and you're kind of like, oh, why doesn't this character do X? And then you have to kind of go, oh, that's actually a really good question. How do we fix that? And through editing, which is a miracle process, obviously you make the film 3 times, writing it, shooting it, and editing it, is what they always say. But the idea that they could find certain shots to make it look like things went a certain way when they didn't. And they did that a couple times, and again, including the ending. And I love kind of hearing that stuff. And they actually show the shots. You're like, oh, if you look at that isolated, you go, oh, wait a minute. Yeah, that doesn't really make sense. But in the moment, the way they cut it together, it totally does. So, but yeah, he talks about like the effectiveness of the nihilism of the film and how it lacks answers and motivation, and how he thought that's part of the reason it resonated. And I agree. I really do think it makes a big difference. Anyway, I'll wrap this up, but a very nice 4K release of The Strangers, with some nice bonus features, some that may be old with a couple that may be new. I'm not 100%. But I do love the film enough that I do think it's worth recommending picking up this 4K because I think it looks great. So kudos to Scream Factory for that. Anyway, thank you so much for listening, and I will talk to you soon. Bye-bye.